Lady Isabella Montrose had been raised to move like a figure painted in oil, to speak as if each word had been measured on scales, and to embody the dignity expected of a duke's only daughter. From her earliest memory, her life had been governed by duty, and though she had not chosen it, she had accepted it with the quiet resolve instilled in her by long years of education and careful oversight. She was 19 now, graceful in stature, tall, yet delicately built, with eyes that carried the deep hue of storm clouds. Her hair, dark and lustrous, was always arranged with the precision demanded by her station, often adorned with ribbons of silver or pearls when occasion required. She lived at Wexford House in London, where marble corridors, gilded ceilings, and richly woven carpets reminded her daily of the expectations that clung to her name. Every tutor, every governess, every governor had seen her not merely as a girl to be formed, but as a vessel to secure her family's future. She learned music, her hands gliding across the harpsichord until the notes seemed part of her breath. She learned French and Italian, speaking them with the measured cadence that pleased visiting diplomats. She learned the rules of courtly dance, her steps always precise, never hurried. Each lesson had been another strand in the web of preparation, for all knew what lay ahead. She would become the bride of Prince Alexander, heir to the English throne. The match had been spoken of as certainty long before she could understand its weight. Courtiers whispered it at banquets, statesmen nodded in approval in council halls, and ladies of noble houses envied the place that seemed reserved for her. It was not spoken as possibility, but as destiny, the kind that brooked no refusal. To most, Isabella was the fortunate one, chosen by lineage and circumstance to wear a crown. She smiled when spoken of in such terms, but deep within there was an unspoken wondering what it might mean to be loved for herself and not merely for the alliance her name represented. The day of the grand ball at St. James's Palace had been marked in the household for months. It would be the evening when speculation turned into declaration, when the prince would publicly affirm what had long been arranged in whispers and sealed in private agreements between families. The announcement was not written in any official paper, yet all of London knew its purpose. Nobles polished their jewels, seamstresses worked through sleepless nights, and carriages were prepared for the spectacle that awaited. Isabella herself was dressed with particular care, her gown chosen in pale blue silk that shimmered in the light of candles. The bodice was embroidered with silver thread in delicate patterns of ivy, the sleeves falling like cascades upon her arms. A necklace of pearls, a gift from her father, lay upon her throat, while satin slippers carried her steps with grace. As the hour approached, her heart stirred with both pride and unease. She had been told all her life that this was her triumph, that to stand beside the prince was to reach the pinnacle of what any woman of her rank could aspire to. Yet she also felt the invisible chains of that triumph, the sense that her life was not hers to shape. She descended the staircase of her father's London residence with composed steps, her head high, aware of every eye upon her. Servants bowed, attendants whispered admiration, and her father offered his arm with silent approval. The streets outside were filled with carriages, the lamps of the city casting long shadows as they rolled toward the palace. The sound of hooves striking cobblestones echoed through the night, mingling with the distant laughter of common folk who gathered to catch sight of the noble procession. Isabella sat in silence, her gloved hands folded upon her lap, her father speaking occasionally of matters of decorum and what would be expected of her once the announcement was made. She listened, though his words were no different from those she had heard 100 times before. The palace itself stood luminous when they arrived, its many windows blazing with candlelight, its gates guarded by men in livery who held back the crowd of onlookers. Inside, the marble halls glowed with the reflection of countless chandeliers, their flames mirrored in the polished floor. Musicians tuned their instruments in the gallery above, and the scent of roses, brought in from the royal gardens, filled the air with a sweetness that seemed almost oppressive. Servants moved briskly, guiding guests to their places, carrying trays of wine and ensuring that the evening's order was maintained with precision. Isabella entered the ballroom as though stepping into a stage prepared for her. Heads turned, fans fluttered, and voices hushed to murmurs. She carried herself with poise, her eyes steady, her every movement a lesson in composure. She saw the faces of noblewomen who studied her gown with veiled envy, of gentlemen who admired her grace with quiet calculation, and of courtiers who whispered to one another of the glory of the match that was about to be confirmed. The orchestra began a stately piece, the air swelling with violins, and the room seemed to glow brighter with expectation. At the far end of the hall stood Prince Alexander. He was dressed in a coat of deep crimson trimmed with gold, his powdered wig perfectly arranged, his posture unyielding. His features bore the smooth confidence of one who had never been denied anything. To the assembly, he appeared as a figure carved from marble, every gesture deliberate, every glance an assertion of power. He waited upon the dais, near the throne reserved for the king, and though he bowed his head slightly in acknowledgement of Isabella's approach, his face betrayed no warmth. Her steps slowed as she drew nearer. The eyes of the court followed her, watching for the subtle interaction between bride and groom. Yet she saw only composure, distance, and the cold reserve of a man who viewed their union not as affection, but as obligation. She placed herself beside him, the murmurs in the hall softening into expectant silence. The air grew heavy with anticipation, as though every breath held back the moment when the prince would speak the words that would bind them. Yet as Isabella stood in her place, the music fading to stillness, her gaze drifted across the sea of faces. At the edge of the crowd, half hidden by shadow, there was a figure who did not seem to belong. He was tall, his bearing confident yet marked by something raw, something unrefined compared to the polished nobles around him. His eyes were fixed upon her with an intensity that pierced through the gilded air, and though his attire was proper, it carried none of the extravagance of those beside him. He stood apart, as if his very presence disturbed the harmony of the court. And in that instant, Isabella sensed that the night would not unfold as the court had so carefully planned. Prince Alexander did not turn his head as Isabella took her place beside him. His hand rested stiffly upon the rail of the dais, his back as straight as the marble pillars behind him. The hall, filled with courtiers, ambassadors, and noble families, trembled with anticipation. Candles flickered in tall candelabras, their flames wavering as though stirred by the collective breath of those assembled. All eyes were fixed upon the heir to the throne, waiting for words that would seal what had long been whispered as inevitable. He lifted his chin, his expression composed, his tone even as he began to address the court. His voice carried across the chamber, steady and commanding, yet it rang with the detachment of duty. He spoke not of Isabella's virtues or the promise of shared life, but of alliances between houses, of stability in uncertain times, of obligations that bound families to the crown. His speech bore the weight of law rather than the warmth of affection. Guests nodded solemnly, some whispering to one another, their expectations subtly shifting as the realization spread that this was not the romantic declaration many had imagined. Isabella stood silent at his side, her eyes lowered though her ears caught every syllable. The words, heavy and cold, fell upon her like stones. She had prepared herself for formality, yet the absence of even the smallest gesture of tenderness stung deeply. To the crowd, she appeared the very image of composure, her posture unbroken, her hands folded gracefully. Inside, however, she felt as though the air had grown thin, each breath strained beneath the knowledge that she was being spoken of as an arrangement, not as a bride. It was in that silence between the prince's words that the unexpected happened. From among the gathered throng, the figure she had glimpsed before stepped forward. At first, the crowd did not react, for interruptions in such a setting were unthinkable. But as he advanced, his presence drew eyes and hushed voices spread like ripples through still water. His face, though unfamiliar to many, bore a resemblance to the prince himself, enough to provoke uncertainty, enough to command attention. Gasps rose as whispers of his name circled the chamber. Raphael, the half-brother. The reminder of scandal long buried beneath courtly decorum. Though his existence was no secret, his presence in the palace was almost unthinkable. He carried himself with boldness, though not with the polished ease of those who had been raised beneath gilded ceilings. His step was firm, his eyes fixed not upon Alexander but upon Isabella. The court recoiled, the rustle of silk and the shifting of shoes on polished marble marking their astonishment. Alexander's voice fell silent, his hand tightening upon the rail as he recognized the intruder. The guards hesitated, uncertain whether to advance or to wait for command. In that moment of hesitation, Raphael crossed the remaining distance. His coat, dark but unadorned compared to the prince's crimson, brushed against the skirts of ladies who pulled back in shock. His presence seemed to pierce the careful order of the evening, his figure a shadow cast upon the brilliance of the chandeliers. Then, with audacity that defied the assembled court, he stood before the dais. His voice rang clear, strong, and unflinching. He asked not for recognition of his blood, nor for forgiveness of his birth. He asked for Isabella's hand. The words struck the chamber like thunder. A wave of disbelief swept the room. Ladies raised their fans to cover parted lips. Gentlemen leaned toward one another with incredulous stares. The ambassadors, gathered to witness the union of crown and nobility, exchanged sharp glances, measuring the scandal as it unfolded before their eyes. The orchestra, which had been poised to resume after the prince's address, faltered into silence, boughs trembling in mid-air. Isabella felt her breath catch. She had not moved, yet the entire weight of the hall seemed to press upon her. Her name, uttered in such a manner, bound her to a gesture she had never sought, never expected. The eyes of the assembly turned upon her, demanding a reaction she could not yet give. The prince beside her grew rigid, his silence more fearsome than if he had spoken. Alexander's hand shifted to the hilt of his sword, the gleam of the weapon visible in the candlelight. His face, pale beneath the powder, betrayed a fury that words could not contain. Yet still he did not speak, as though silence itself could cast Raphael into nothingness. The king's advisers, seated near the throne, exchanged troubled looks, uncertain whether to intervene. The guards remained frozen, awaiting a signal that did not come. The moment stretched unbearably. Raphael's declaration lingered in the air, impossible to ignore, impossible to erase. Isabella felt the weight of her position more heavily than ever, her body a statue before the judgment of the court. She could neither move nor speak without altering the course of her life, and yet she had no power to stop the chaos that had already begun. The hall, once so carefully arranged for triumph, had become a theater of scandal. Whispers rose like a storm, fragments of disbelief carried across the marble chamber. The illegitimate son, how dare he? Before the throne itself, each murmur twisted the air tighter, each glance fastened upon Isabella with sharper scrutiny. And still, the king had not spoken. His silence hung over the chamber, heavier than the chandeliers above, while the court held its breath for his judgment. The silence that followed Raphael's words was unbearable, stretched thin as glass about to shatter. No one dared breathe too loudly. No one shifted their feet without drawing the weight of curious stares. Isabella stood motionless at the prince's side, her hands clasped tightly before her, though every pulse within her body hammered with confusion and dread. She had not spoken, had not even raised her eyes from the floor, yet she felt herself already condemned in the judgment of the court. The chamber, filled with the finest of England's nobility, seemed to lean forward as one. Whispers collided, skirts rustled, fans snapped open and shut. Every gaze fixed upon Isabella, as though she had conspired with Raphael, as though his audacity reflected a secret desire of her own. She wished the floor might open and swallow her. Yet she remained frozen, aware that any movement could be interpreted as confirmation of guilt. Raphael, for his part, stood tall before the dais, his declaration unwithdrawn. His eyes did not waver from her, and in their intensity she read not triumph but something more reckless, more desperate. She could not bear to meet his gaze for long, for in it lay the certainty that her fate had been twisted in an instant. Then came the sharp command of the guards. 2 men in livery pushed through the crowd, their boots striking the marble with the finality of judgment. They seized Raphael by the arms, though he did not resist. Murmurs of relief mingled with renewed whispers of scandal, the assembly eager to see order restored. Yet the damage had been done. The boldness of his words hung heavier than any restraint, echoing in every corner of the hall. Prince Alexander remained silent, though his face had turned a shade colder than stone. His hand still rested on the hilt of his sword, his knuckles white, his jaw set in fury. He did not glance at Isabella, not once, though she felt the burn of his contempt as keenly as if it were a physical blow. His silence was more terrifying than rage, for it left her suspended in shame without the mercy of an outburst to end it. When the guards dragged Raphael toward the doors, the orchestra attempted to resume, strings trembling into a hesitant melody. Yet the notes faltered, unable to mask the storm of whispers that surged through the hall. The ball that had been meant to confirm triumph had collapsed into spectacle, its order ruined beyond repair. Guests clustered in small knots, their words sharp and quick, their expressions avid with the delight of scandal. Isabella heard fragments carried on the air. Humiliation, disgrace, ruined, words that struck her like stones against glass. Her father, standing near the edge of the dais, looked upon her with a sternness that pierced more deeply than any stranger's whisper. He had guarded her reputation as carefully as his own fortune, and now she stood exposed before him, her name entangled with a man branded illegitimate. She longed to protest her innocence, to declare that she had been no part of the intrusion, but the weight of the hall's judgment smothered her voice. The night dragged onward, though for Isabella it moved as though time had slowed to a cruel crawl. Courtiers avoided her with studied politeness, their bows and curtsies offered without warmth. Some turned away altogether, eager to distance themselves from disgrace. Prince Alexander departed the hall without a word, his retinue following, leaving behind an air of wrath that promised reckoning yet to come. Isabella stood abandoned on the dais until her father at last took her arm and led her away. Back in her chambers, silence pressed upon her more heavily than the noise of the ballroom. She dismissed her attendants with a faint gesture, unwilling to endure their pitying looks. Alone, she allowed her composure to crumble. She sank into the chair by her dressing table, the candles flickering in their sconces, and wept silently, her shoulders shaking beneath the weight of shame. The pearls about her neck felt like a chain, each bead cold against her skin. Tears blurred her reflection in the mirror. She saw not the poised figure presented to the court, but a young woman stripped of dignity, her future clouded by forces she could not control. The path she had walked since childhood, so clearly defined, had been shattered in a single moment by words she had not invited. She imagined the whispers echoing through London even now, the gossip spreading from house to house, each retelling darker than the last. The hours passed in sorrow. She thought of Alexander, his coldness at the ball, the fury in his silence, the certainty that he would blame her as though she had plotted Raphael's intrusion. She thought of Raphael, reckless and desperate, his declaration dragging her into ruin whether he had intended it or not. She thought of herself, trapped between 2 men, neither of whom had sought her consent. Her life felt less her own than ever before, her worth measured only in the alliances others wished to claim. When at last she rose, the chamber seemed unbearably still. The roses arranged in porcelain vases had begun to wilt, their petals drooping in silence, as if mocking the fragility of beauty. The moon shone pale through the high windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Isabella walked to the heavy curtains and drew them aside, staring into the night as though it might offer escape. The gardens below lay veiled in mist, their paths winding like ribbons through the dark. She pressed her hand against the cold glass, her breath clouding its surface. Her tears had dried, leaving her eyes heavy, her heart hollow. The humiliation of the night weighed upon her, each moment replaying in her mind with merciless clarity. She longed for a refuge beyond the reach of gossip, beyond the chains of duty. Yet such a place seemed distant, perhaps unreachable. She turned away from the window, ready to surrender herself to restless sleep. And then, from the shadows beyond the misted glass, she caught sight of movement in the garden below, a solitary figure pacing restlessly among the hedges. It was not the restless pacing of a stranger, nor the bold intrusion of the man who had brought her world into disarray, but the deliberate step of one who knew the household well. The figure moved slowly along the gravel path, pausing beneath the lanterns placed at intervals in the garden, the faint light casting her face into view. Lady Margaret, Isabella's widowed aunt, had chosen the hour when the household slept to walk among the hedges, as she often did when wakefulness pressed heavily upon her. Isabella, watching from above, felt a surge of relief at the familiar presence. She left the window and crossed the chamber, her hands trembling as she opened the door into the dim corridor. The air was hushed, filled only with the faint creak of timber as her slippers touched the floor. She descended the staircase, guided by the glow of wall sconces left burning through the night. The stillness of the house, so unlike the grandeur and noise of the palace, wrapped about her, though it offered little comfort. The memory of the ballroom still burned in her mind, the shame, the whispers, the prince's silence, and the sudden ruin of everything that had been promised to her. Lady Margaret turned as Isabella stepped into the garden. The night air was cool, heavy with the scent of damp earth and roses that had not yet lost their fragrance. Margaret's expression softened when she saw her niece, though her eyes reflected the wisdom of one who had endured much herself. She reached out a hand, and Isabella took it with the eagerness of a child clinging to safety. They walked together along the gravel paths, their steps unhurried, the silence between them more comforting than words. When at last they paused beneath an arch of climbing ivy, Isabella released the storm that had gathered in her heart. She spoke of the humiliation, the stares of the court, the cold indifference of the prince, and the reckless intrusion of Raphael. Her voice broke, her composure crumbled, and she confessed the fear that her name had been ruined beyond repair. Margaret listened without interruption, her gaze steady upon her niece, her hand still clasping Isabella's in quiet strength. When Isabella fell silent, exhausted by her own grief, Margaret finally spoke. She reminded her that the crown was not a gift, but a burden, that marriage to a prince did not promise happiness, only duty. She spoke of her own youth, when she had been bound to a man chosen for her, a union that had brought wealth and title but little tenderness. She confessed that her heart had once leaned toward another, one who had been dismissed as unsuitable, and that the regret of surrendering to duty had lingered through every year of her widowhood. Her words did not diminish Isabella's sorrow, yet they stirred something new beneath it. The thought that she was not alone in her struggle, that another woman had once stood at the same threshold of choice, planted a seed of quiet rebellion within her. Margaret's voice was calm, yet there was fire in her counsel, the fire of one who urged her niece not to surrender so easily to chains, not to believe that humiliation defined her worth. Isabella listened, the weight upon her shoulders shifting, not lessened, but changed. The night deepened around them, the mist rising over the garden like a veil. Isabella lifted her eyes to the stars scattered faintly across the sky. For the first time since the ball, she felt the faint stirrings of something that was not despair, a fragile sense of possibility, a question of whether her destiny was truly as fixed as all had insisted. Her heart still trembled with fear, but within it, another rhythm began to beat, one that spoke of strength, not yet tested. They lingered in silence, the cool night air brushing against their faces, the gravel crunching softly beneath their feet as they turned back toward the house. Isabella's steps felt unsteady, yet lighter than before. She did not know what future awaited her, nor how the court would respond to the scandal that had already been unleashed. But she knew now that she was not without choice, not without the power to shape some small measure of her fate. As she climbed the staircase to her chamber once more, the candlelight flickering along the walls, she carried with her aunt's words, not as comfort alone, but as a challenge. Her tears had dried, though her heart remained restless, caught between sorrow and the faintest whisper of defiance. She reached her chamber door, laid her hand upon the latch and paused. For beyond the heavy wood, she sensed the silence was not entirely empty. The silence within Isabella's chamber pressed upon her as she entered, but it no longer felt suffocating in the way it had on the night of the ball. The words of Lady Margaret echoed in her mind, not gentle reassurances alone, but an urging to see her life as something that might yet be shaped by her own will. Isabella stood still in the center of the room, her hands resting lightly upon the carved wood of the dressing table, her reflection caught in the dim mirror. Her face bore the traces of sleeplessness, but her eyes no longer carried only despair. They carried questions, and with them, the faintest spark of resolve. In the days that followed, her father agreed that she should leave the palace behind, at least for a time. The explanation was simple enough. Her health required rest, her spirit quiet. Few questioned it openly, for the scandal still lingered in whispers, and her absence would allow the gossip to settle. Thus she returned to her family's estate in the countryside, far from the glitter of chandeliers and the suffocating murmur of court. The journey itself was long, the carriage swaying over uneven roads, the air filled with the scent of damp fields and autumn leaves. Isabella sat in silence, her gloved hand resting against the window frame, her eyes fixed on the landscape that stretched endlessly beyond. It was a land she had known as a child, yet now it appeared new, as though seen with different eyes. The broad meadows, the rows of oak trees, the winding rivers glinting in the sun, all stood in sharp contrast to the gilded walls of London. She felt a strange relief, as if the distance itself allowed her to breathe more freely. When at last they arrived, the great house of her father's estate stood solemn against the horizon. Its stone walls bore ivy that climbed toward the high windows, and its gardens spread wide, filled with hedges shaped in careful lines and orchards stretching toward the woods. Servants hurried to receive her, their steps echoing in the wide hall as trunks were carried upstairs. Isabella moved through the rooms with a sense of both familiarity and distance, as if the house remembered her more vividly than she remembered it. The following mornings unfolded with a rhythm unlike that of London. The bells of the palace no longer dictated her hours. Instead, she rose with the light of dawn, when the mist still clung to the fields. She walked alone through the gardens, her gown brushing against dew-laden grass, her fingers trailing along the rough bark of ancient trees. The air was cool, filled with the cries of birds and the rustle of leaves. In such solitude she discovered a calm she had not known in years, though beneath it her thoughts still turned restlessly toward the past weeks. It was during one of these walks, beneath the canopy of oaks, that she heard the sound of hooves. At first she thought little of it, for horses often crossed the estate, yet the rhythm of this approach was different, purposeful, insistent. She turned toward the lane that cut through the orchard and saw a rider. His figure grew clearer as he drew near, and even before his face came into view, her heart tightened with recognition. Raphael. He dismounted with a swiftness that revealed both determination and hesitation. His presence here, on her family's estate, was bold enough to stir every doubt within her. He approached slowly, as though aware of the impropriety of the moment, yet unwilling to remain at a distance. Isabella stood rooted to the ground, torn between the instinct to retreat and the need to understand why he had followed her. When he stopped before her, there was no triumph in his bearing, no trace of the audacity that had filled the ballroom. His eyes carried the weight of years spent in shadows, years marked by exclusion, and the bitterness of illegitimacy. He spoke of himself, not with pride, but with a candor that startled her. He spoke of a life lived on the edges of recognition, of doors closed and honors denied, of a longing that had driven him to act with reckless boldness at the ball. His voice carried not arrogance, but vulnerability, and it unsettled her more than defiance ever could. Isabella listened, her face unreadable, though her thoughts surged within her. She had wished to hate him for the humiliation he had caused, to cast him from her heart as a man who had stolen her dignity. Yet as he spoke, she heard not a usurper of her fate, but a man weary of being nameless, one who had sought, in one desperate moment, to seize something true. She could not answer him then, for her heart was too torn, but she did not send him away. In the days that followed, he returned again, not with bold declarations, but with a quieter presence. They walked together through the gardens, their steps unhurried, their words measured. He asked nothing of her but time, and in that time he revealed more of himself. He spoke of the solitude that had shaped him, of the silence that had been forced upon him, of the way he had learned to endure contempt without letting it harden his soul. Isabella, in turn, found herself speaking in ways she had not before, not of duty or expectation, but of her own fears, her own longings. Their walks became a rhythm. Beneath the branches of the oaks, by the still waters of the pond, along the paths lined with roses, they discovered a companionship that was unlike the cold formality she had known at the prince's side. In Raphael's gaze there was no calculation, no sense of possession. Instead, there was a quiet respect, an attentiveness that unsettled her because it felt like freedom. Yet even as she began to sense trust forming between them, a shadow lingered at the edges of her thoughts. She knew the world would not forgive such meetings, that whispers would cling to her once more if they became known. She knew too that her heart, though cautious, was not immune to his presence. There was danger in every step she took beside him, danger that could undo what little peace she had reclaimed. One morning, as they walked along the bank of the river that bordered the estate, the water glinting in the pale sun, the sound of galloping hooves broke through the calm. Isabella turned swiftly, her gown catching in the wind, as a rider approached at full speed, the royal seal gleaming upon his satchel. The rider did not slow until he reached the very edge of the river bank, his horse's hooves scattering pebbles and sending ripples across the calm water. The animal snorted, its breath visible in the cool air, while the messenger dismounted with practiced haste. His cloak was damp from the mist, but the seal pressed upon his satchel was unmistakable. Raphael stepped forward instinctively, his posture protective, though Isabella's gaze was fixed only on the wax emblem that glowed red against the leather. The messenger bowed stiffly, removed the letter, and extended it toward her with the formality of a command rather than a courtesy. Isabella's fingers trembled as she broke the seal. The parchment crackled as it unfolded, and the neat, firm hand that filled its surface sent a chill through her before she had read a word. Each line struck like iron. Prince Alexander would come to the estate within the week. The letter bore no flourishes, no gentle phrasing. It was not a request but an announcement, an assertion of power. Her breath caught as she read it again, her eyes fixed on the words until they blurred. The prince was not content to let the matter fade into silence. He would come himself, in person, to confront what he saw as betrayal. The countryside, which had felt a refuge, now seemed fragile, its peace no more than a thin veil easily torn away. Raphael's jaw tightened as he watched her fold the letter with care, his silence betraying the storm that stirred within him. By evening, the house stirred with preparations. Servants polished floors, hung fresh draperies, and trimmed the gardens, all under the heavy knowledge that their work was not merely for display, but for judgment. The estate was to become a stage for confrontation, and every stone, every candle, every polished surface seemed to anticipate the prince's gaze. Isabella moved through the halls with calm steps, though her heart quivered with unease. She had faced whispers and humiliation before, but now she would face Alexander himself, in her own home, where retreat would no longer be possible. The day of his arrival dawned gray, the sky veiled by clouds that promised rain. The estate seemed to hold its breath as the sound of wheels and hooves carried across the fields. Isabella stood at one of the high windows, her hands clasped tightly at her waist as the prince's carriage came into view. It gleamed black and gold against the muted landscape, drawn by horses that tossed their manes impatiently. Behind it, a retinue of riders formed a scarlet and silver procession that filled the lane like a river of authority. When Alexander stepped from the carriage, his boots striking the gravel with measured force, the estate itself seemed smaller in his presence. His coat was trimmed in embroidery of gold thread, his sword gleamed at his side, and his powdered wig sat immaculately upon his head. His face bore no hint of warmth. It was carved in stern resolve, the mask of one who carried the crown's authority upon his shoulders. He did not pause to admire the gardens, nor acknowledge the household gathered to receive him. His eyes were fixed forward, sharp as a blade. Isabella descended the staircase to meet him, her gown pale against the dark oak panels of the hall. When she reached the entrance, she curtsied with practiced grace, her heart pounding beneath her bodice. Alexander inclined his head slightly, his courtesy no more than the movement required. He stepped past her into the hall, his retinue following, the sound of their boots echoing through the vast space. The air thickened with the weight of their presence. It was only once the company had assembled in the great chamber that Alexander turned to face her. His voice was controlled, measured, yet it carried the sharp edge of accusation. He spoke of duty, of honor, of the expectations that bound her to him and to the crown. He accused her of allowing disgrace by entertaining the presence of Raphael, of failing to guard her name as carefully as the throne demanded. His words did not shout, yet they cut with a precision sharper than anger. Isabella felt the eyes of the household upon her. Her father, the servants, the attendants, even Raphael, who had entered quietly at the edge of the chamber. Their presence pressed upon her, but the greater weight was Alexander's authority. He spoke not as a suitor, but as a master addressing disobedience. He reminded her and all present that the union between them was no matter of choice. It was necessity, sealed by years of arrangement, sanctified by the crown itself. For a moment, silence threatened to suffocate her. Her hands trembled at her sides, her throat tightened with the weight of unspoken words. The humiliation of the ballroom, the whispers that had followed her, the cold indifference of the prince, the reckless boldness of Raphael, all of it pressed upon her in that single instant. But beneath it, she felt the echo of Lady Margaret's counsel, the fire of truth spoken in the garden. Her head lifted. Her voice, when it came, was steady though soft. She denied the prince's right to treat her as possession. She declared herself not merely a name to secure an alliance, not merely a figure to adorn the throne. Her words were not shouted, yet they struck the chamber with greater force than if they had been. The silence that followed was thunderous. Servants lowered their eyes, her father shifted uneasily, and Raphael's shoulders tensed. Alexander's face hardened, his lips pressed into a line as cold as steel. His pride, wounded before the court, had now been struck in the heart of her own household. His hand rested upon the hilt of his sword once more, his eyes locked upon Isabella with a fury that words alone could not contain. And in that silence, he vowed that she would regret such insolence. The echo of the prince's words lingered in the chamber long after he had spoken them. His retinue shifted uneasily, their polished boots scuffing against the stone floor, while the household servants held their breath as if even the faintest sound might bring Alexander's wrath upon them. Isabella stood tall, though her heart thundered within her chest. She had spoken with more defiance than she had ever dared before, and the silence that followed bore the weight of consequence. Alexander's eyes remained fixed upon her, hard and merciless. He did not speak again, but his gaze conveyed the certainty that her words would not be forgotten, nor forgiven. With a sharp motion of his hand, he signaled for his men to withdraw. The sound of their departure filled the hall like a storm retreating over distant hills. When the door closed behind them, the house seemed to exhale, though no one spoke. Isabella turned away, her body trembling now that the moment had passed. The hours after his visit were heavy with unease. Whispers stirred in every corridor of the estate. Servants exchanged fearful glances, convinced that the prince's threat would bring ruin. Isabella's father paced the drawing room, his steps quick and restless, his brow furrowed with the burden of impossible choice. To defy the crown was to risk disgrace. To surrender his daughter was to condemn her spirit. Neither path offered peace. Isabella herself retreated to the solitude of her chamber, though sleep would not come to her. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw Alexander's face, pale with fury, and heard his vow repeated in her mind. By the following morning, the weight of gossip had already begun its march. Word of Alexander's journey to the countryside spread swiftly to London, carried by those eager to tell and retell the scandal. In drawing rooms and at market stalls, voices murmured that Lady Isabella Montrose had dared defy the heir to the throne. Some said she had rejected him outright, others that she had been bewitched by Raphael. Each retelling added fuel to the fire until the truth was lost beneath the smoke of invention. Raphael became the object of every venomous tongue. He was called a usurper, a shadow who dared to grasp at light that did not belong to him. Rumors whispered that he would be sent away, perhaps across the sea, perhaps to some distant post from which he would never return. The thought of exile hung in the air of the estate like a storm waiting to break. Isabella heard it from the servants, their voices hushed, their eyes wide with fear. She felt it in the silence of her father, who spoke little and carried the look of a man caught in the tightening grip of royal command. Yet Raphael did not retreat. Each day he remained near her, though always with restraint. He did not demand her presence, but their paths crossed in the gardens, along the orchard, by the quiet riverbank where the trees cast long shadows. His very presence was defiance, though unspoken, a refusal to vanish even when threatened. Isabella found herself drawn to that courage, though it filled her with dread as well. Every step they took together was heavy with the knowledge that the crown's eyes lingered upon them from afar. The estate itself seemed to mirror their turmoil. Where once the halls had carried the calm of countryside peace, now each footfall echoed with unease. The servants no longer spoke freely, their voices clipped and careful, as though the walls themselves might carry words back to London. Isabella's father received letters daily, each one marked by the seal of authority, each one demanding more urgently that the union between Isabella and Alexander be confirmed without delay. She saw him hold the letters in his hands, his knuckles white, before retreating to his study, where the candles burned long into the night. For Isabella, the weight of choice pressed heavier with each passing hour. She knew what was expected: to yield, to silence her defiance, to walk obediently toward the throne, as though her heart were of no consequence. Yet the thought of such surrender filled her with dread that chilled her more deeply than Alexander's fury. Raphael's presence reminded her that another life was possible, uncertain, dangerous, but real. It was this possibility that both frightened and sustained her. The fragile hope that she might choose for herself, even if the world condemned her for it. As days turned to a week, the rumors in London grew louder. Letters from distant cousins and acquaintances arrived at the estate, filled with veiled reproaches and thinly disguised curiosity. Some pleaded with Isabella to reconsider, warning her of the ruin that awaited. Others condemned her outright, their words steeped in the poison of envy and scandal. Isabella read them with steady eyes, though each sentence was a fresh reminder of how deeply society had bound her fate to its judgment. The tension reached its height one evening when her father entered her chamber with a letter still warm from the wax seal. His voice was grave as he read aloud the king's command. Isabella must marry Alexander, or her family would face the loss of royal favor, the weight of disgrace that could destroy all they had built. The words were final, unyielding, heavy as stone. Her father's voice faltered as he finished, and in his eyes, Isabella saw the torment of a man torn between loyalty to crown and love for his child. When he departed, leaving her alone once more, Isabella sat in silence beside the window. The countryside stretched before her, the fields dark beneath the evening sky, the river glinting faintly in the last of the light. She thought of Alexander's vow, of the court's whispers, of her father's weary face. She thought of Raphael, who remained near even as threats gathered around him, his very presence a challenge to the order that sought to cage her. The candles burned low, their wax spilling upon the silver holders, as Isabella bowed her head into her hands. She felt the weight of the crown pressing upon her, though she did not wear it, a burden heavy enough to crush her spirit. Yet beneath that weight, she sensed a flicker of defiance that no letter, no command, no threat could extinguish. It stirred within her like the faintest flame, fragile yet alive, waiting for the moment when it might blaze into certainty. And when at last she lifted her eyes, she knew the storm had reached its breaking point, for the chapel on the estate grounds lay in shadow, and within its walls, Raphael waited for her decision. The chapel stood quiet at the far edge of the estate, its stone walls veiled in ivy, its arched windows glowing faintly from the candles flickering within. The night was still, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth after a brief rain. Isabella crossed the garden paths alone, her steps deliberate, her gown brushing against the dew-soaked grass. The hush of the hour deepened her thoughts, each footfall echoing the weight of the decision she carried. When she reached the chapel doors, she paused. Her hand hovered over the iron handle, her breath uneven. She knew what awaited her inside. Not command, not decree, but a man whose presence defied all the expectations that had bound her life since childhood. The prince's threats still rang in her ears, her father's weary voice still pressed upon her, and yet the pull toward that shadowed chapel was stronger than fear. She pressed the door open, and the hinges gave a low groan that faded into the silence of the nave. Raphael stood at the front, near the simple altar where 2 candles flickered. The faint light touched his face, casting his features in sharp relief. There was no grandeur in his bearing, no trace of courtly arrogance, only the stillness of a man who had waited through uncertainty and risked everything by remaining. He turned as she entered, and in his eyes there was not demand but quiet resolve. He did not move toward her, but stood as though every step depended on her will alone. Isabella advanced slowly, the echo of her footsteps sounding against the stone floor. She felt the tension between them, not sharp or violent, but heavy with all that had gone unsaid. When she reached him, she stopped just before the altar, the space between them alive with silence. Raphael drew a breath, steady and deep, as though gathering words not rehearsed, but born of truth. He spoke of himself plainly, without embellishment. He admitted what the world saw in him, the illegitimate son, the shadow cast by a crown that would never be his. He confessed the folly of his intrusion at the ball, the recklessness of a man who had long been denied, and who, in a moment of desperation, sought to claim what might give meaning to his life. Yet beyond confession, he revealed something deeper, that his heart had found its only crown in her presence. That love, not ambition, had moved him to speak, when silence would have spared him disgrace. The words filled the chapel with a weight greater than ceremony. Isabella listened, her chest rising and falling with each breath, her hands trembling though she held them clasped before her. His voice did not falter, yet there was no arrogance in it, only sincerity, steady as the flame of the candles. He ended not with a demand, but with an offering, his gaze steady upon her. He could give her no throne, no court, no grandeur, only himself, his loyalty, his devotion, and a life lived in truth. For a moment, Isabella closed her eyes. The silence pressed around her, filled with all the choices she had been made to bear since childhood. She saw the palace, the chandeliers, the faces that had judged her. She heard the prince's cold voice, felt the weight of his scorn, and remembered the sting of standing silent while the court whispered ruin. She felt her father's hand upon her arm, heavy with duty, worn by fear of disgrace. All these images crowded her mind, demanding submission. But then she saw more. She saw the gardens of the estate, the morning walks by the river, the moments of quiet conversation with Raphael beneath the oaks. She remembered his unguarded honesty, his willingness to stand near her even when threatened, his eyes that sought not possession, but understanding. For the first time, she felt what it might mean to be chosen not as a name, not as an alliance, but as a woman. Her heart beat with painful force as she opened her eyes once more. She looked at Raphael, who stood waiting, his future suspended on the breath between them. The choice before her was stark: to yield to the crown, to bow beneath duty and live in silence, or to step into uncertainty, bound not by command, but by her own will. Her lips parted, her voice soft yet clear. She accepted his hand, not as a defiance of the prince alone, but as a declaration of her own freedom. The words left her trembling, yet within them she found strength she had never known. The chapel seemed to brighten, the candles burning taller, as though reflecting the flame now kindled in her. Raphael's breath caught, his expression breaking from restraint into unspoken relief. Their hands met, and in that touch lay the certainty of a choice that no decree could undo. The stillness that followed was deep, but it did not last. From outside the chapel came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, quick and purposeful, drawing nearer across the damp earth. The sound of approaching steps grew louder, echoing against the stone walls of the chapel, as though the very building were bracing itself for intrusion. Isabella's hand lingered in Raphael's, their palms warm against one another, but her heart leapt with fear. She turned toward the door, her breath caught, expecting at any moment to see the prince himself or his men bursting through the threshold. But when the heavy door creaked open, it was her father who entered. His cloak clung damp to his shoulders, his face marked by sleepless hours and the burden of decisions that weighed heavier than rank or land. For a long moment, he stood in silence, his eyes fixed on the sight before him, his daughter's hand resting in Raphael's. The flickering candlelight made the scene appear both fragile and unyielding, as though time itself had paused to witness it. The Duke's expression was grave, but behind the severity lay a weariness that had grown over weeks of turmoil. He stepped forward slowly, his boots striking the stone floor with steady rhythm. Isabella braced herself, prepared for reproach, for command, for the authority of a father bound by loyalty to the crown. Yet his words, when they came, carried none of the sharpness she feared. His voice was low, heavy with resignation. He spoke of the king's letters, of the threats that shadowed their family name, of the disgrace that hovered so near it could be felt like storm air. He admitted that every instinct as a nobleman urged him to force her back into obedience, to preserve the bond with the crown, no matter the cost. But then his voice faltered, and his eyes softened as he looked upon his only daughter. He confessed that he could not compel her into a union that would strip her spirit, that duty to the throne could not outweigh his duty as a father. His words were not approval, but they were permission, reluctant, sorrowful, yet real. Isabella's breath trembled as relief spread through her, not bright or jubilant, but steady, like ground beneath her feet after long unsteadiness. Raphael bowed his head in silent acknowledgement, the tension in his frame loosening at last. The Duke did not meet his gaze for long, yet his lack of command to leave was concession enough. After a pause that stretched like a sigh, he turned and departed the chapel, his cloak brushing against the floor, leaving the two alone once more. The days that followed unfolded with surprising stillness. No royal guard arrived at the estate. No messenger came bearing further decrees. The storm of threats seemed to lose its force, as if the crown itself had chosen to let the matter settle in silence. In the halls of the house, relief mingled with unease, for though no punishment came, the weight of scandal still lingered. Servants moved more freely, yet their eyes still carried caution when they looked upon Isabella and Raphael together. At last, the decision was made. There would be no palace ceremony, no gilded pageantry. Instead, the vows would be spoken in the very chapel where Isabella had chosen her path. The morning of the wedding arrived quietly. The gardens were damp with dew, the hedges trimmed with care, though no crowd pressed against them to watch. Within the chapel, the air was filled with the faint scent of flowers gathered from the estate gardens, roses, lilies, and sprigs of lavender placed in simple vases along the stone ledges. Isabella wore no crown, no jewels save the modest pearl necklace she had always treasured. Her gown was of pale cream silk, unadorned save for lace at the sleeves, its simplicity carrying a beauty that no court could diminish. Raphael stood waiting at the altar, dressed with equal restraint, his coat dark but clean, his bearing solemn and steady. Around them, a handful of faces bore witness. Her father, grave but resolute. Lady Margaret, her eyes softened by pride. A few trusted attendants who had served the household faithfully. The vows were spoken in quiet voices that filled the small space with greater weight than any royal proclamation could. There were no trumpets, no heralds, only the sound of words carried by sincerity. When Isabella's hand was placed in Raphael's, when their promises were sealed with the blessing of the clergyman, she felt not the burden of chains, but the freedom of choice. In that moment, she was not a pawn of alliances, nor a prize to be displayed, but a woman who had claimed her own destiny. When they stepped from the chapel together, husband and wife, the air outside was fresh with the scent of the fields. A breeze stirred through the branches of the oaks, carrying with it the soft rustle of leaves, like a hymn of quiet blessing. Isabella lifted her eyes to the horizon, where the morning light broke through the clouds, and for the first time she felt the path before her was her own. The days that followed their union passed with a gentleness that stood in contrast to the turmoil that had preceded it. No grand banquets announced their bond, no proclamations were posted upon palace gates. Yet within the quiet of the countryside, they built a life marked not by spectacle but by truth. Evenings were spent before the fire, mornings among the fields, the rhythm of the estate shaping their days. Isabella found peace in the simplicity of it, in the knowledge that her choice had not been forced but freely made. And as she walked one evening through the gardens, her hand resting lightly in Raphael's, she knew that her heart, once burdened by fear and humiliation, had found the calm it had long been denied. The scandal, the whispers, the threats, they had passed like a storm, leaving behind clear skies. She was no princess, no queen, but in her freedom she was more sovereign than she had ever been. The evening descended slowly over the countryside, drawing long shadows across the estate grounds as the sun lingered in its last descent beyond the hills. The fields glowed with a muted gold, the air filled with the hum of insects settling for the night. Isabella walked beside Raphael through the gardens, their steps unhurried, their hands lightly entwined. The stillness of the hour carried a serenity unlike any she had known in the gilded halls of the palace. For the first time in her life, she felt no weight pressing upon her, no gaze watching to measure her movements. The world seemed to belong only to them. They paused beneath the great oak that stood at the center of the lawn, its branches stretching like a canopy against the fading sky. Raphael turned to face her, his eyes fixed upon her as though he could not believe she truly stood before him. There was no crown upon his brow, no court behind him, no recognition from the world that had always turned him aside. Yet in that moment, he bore the quiet majesty of a man who had been chosen, not by blood or birth, but by love itself. Isabella lifted her face to him, the last light of the sunset painting her features in warm hues. Her hair caught the breeze, her gown brushing softly against the grass. She had once imagined herself adorned in jewels, seated upon a throne, the subject of envy and admiration. Now she knew that none of those dreams had been her own, but the world's vision forced upon her. Here, in the simplicity of twilight, with Raphael's hand steady in hers, she felt richer than any crown could make her. They lingered in silence, letting the moment speak for them. At last Raphael's voice broke softly into the still air. He spoke not of fear or of scandal, not of the disgrace he had borne, nor the threats that had shadowed them. Instead, he spoke of what lay before them, A life built upon truth rather than illusion. A union free of chains. A love chosen with courage. His words were quiet, yet they filled Isabella with warmth that no echo of the court could extinguish. She answered not with a declaration, but with a gesture. She lifted his hand to her lips, pressing it gently, a reverence that carried more meaning than any spoken vow. When she looked into his eyes again, she saw not the illegitimate brother whom the world had scorned, but the man who had stood by her when all else demanded her silence. He was not a shadow to her, but the very light that had led her out of darkness. The stars began to appear, faint at first, then brighter as the last of the day gave way to night. They walked back toward the chapel, now quiet after the vows spoken within its walls. The windows glowed faintly with the candles that had not yet been extinguished, their light soft and steady. They paused at its threshold, and Isabella turned to look once more at the fields stretching into the distance. She thought of the path she had left behind, of the palace halls and the chains of duty. For the first time she felt no regret. The life she had chosen, though humbler, was more radiant in its truth than any crown could have offered. As they stepped inside, the hush of the chapel embraced them. The flowers gathered for their vows still perfumed the air, their petals beginning to fade, yet carrying the memory of that morning's union. The candles burned low, their flames casting long shadows upon the stone floor. Isabella stood at the altar once more, her hand in Raphael's, her heart steady. She felt the weight of the past weeks, the humiliation, the fear, the defiance, all melt into the stillness of this single moment. Raphael drew her close, his hands resting lightly upon her shoulders, his gaze searching hers with a tenderness that made her breath catch. He bent toward her, not with the boldness of possession but with the reverence of a man who cherished what had been freely given. Their lips met, a kiss that was neither hurried nor restrained, but filled with the certainty of love that had endured trial and emerged stronger for it. The chapel seemed to hold its breath, the air alive with the quiet passion of two hearts bound at last in peace. When they parted, Isabella rested her forehead against his, her eyes closed, her lips curved with a smile that was both tender and triumphant. She had feared once that her life would be dictated by duty alone, but here she stood, having chosen her own path. Her happiness was not the world's gift, but her own. They lingered there as the night deepened, the stars wheeling unseen beyond the chapel walls. No sound of carriages, no murmur of courtiers, no echo of gossip intruded. Only the soft rustle of the wind through the ivy, only the steady rhythm of their breathing, only the warmth of hands that would never again let go. At last they stepped outside once more, the cool night air brushing against their faces. The sky above was clear, the stars blazing brighter now, the moon casting silver light upon the fields. Isabella lifted her eyes to that endless expanse, and in its vastness she felt her heart expand with gratitude. She thought of the women who would come after her, women bound by expectation, silenced by duty. She wished that her choice might whisper to them across time that courage is not the absence of fear, but the strength to follow the truth of one's heart. Her gaze lowered to Raphael, who stood beside her, his expression softened by the starlight. She knew the world would never crown him, never place upon his head the ornaments of royalty. Yet to her, he was sovereign, not by decree, but by devotion. In him she had found not a throne, but a home, not a kingdom, but a love, truer than any alliance. She took his hand once more, and together they walked toward the estate, their steps measured, their silence filled with promise. The night enfolded them, the stars bearing witness, the fields stretching wide as though to embrace the life they would build. Isabella's heart was calm, her spirit free, her future no longer a prison, but a path she had chosen. And so the story of crowns and scandal faded into memory, leaving only the truth that endured, that love, once chosen with courage, becomes the finest crown of all. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.